I never thought I'd be the one to catch enemy spies on American soil. My name is Special Agent Thomas Brennan, and in the summer of 1942, I was a 32-year-old FBI agent stationed in New York City, working counterintelligence operations during the darkest days of World War II. The war had been raging in Europe for nearly 3 years, and America had been in the fight for just 7 months since Pearl Harbor. Enemy submarines prowled our coastlines, saboteurs were a constant threat, and every day brought new challenges in protecting the homeland from Nazi Germany's intelligence operations. But nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for the bizarre sequence of events that began on a foggy June morning, when 4 German agents waded ashore on Long Island and immediately made mistakes so fundamental that they practically announced their presence to anyone paying attention. The morning of June 13th, 1942, started with a phone call that yanked me out of a dead sleep at 04:30 hours. My apartment in Brooklyn was small and unremarkable, the kind of place a government salary could afford in wartime New York. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the darkness, and I fumbled for it, knowing that calls at this hour never brought good news. "Brennan," I answered, my voice rough with sleep. "Tom, it's Jim Matthews at the New York field office. We've got a situation on Long Island. Coast Guard spotted suspicious activity near Amagansett Beach around 00:30 hours. A guardsman encountered 4 men on the beach who claimed to be fishermen, but something didn't add up. They spoke with heavy accents, were wearing strange clothes, and one of them tried to bribe the guardsman. After the guardsman left, he reported it and went back with reinforcements, but the men were gone." Coast Guard found evidence of a submarine landing and buried equipment. Director Hoover wants counterintelligence on this immediately. I was already getting dressed, the phone cradled between my shoulder and ear. "I'll be there in an hour. Get me everything the Coast Guard has and put surveillance on all transportation hubs. If these men are who I think they are, they'll be trying to get into the city." The drive out to Long Island took me through the pre-dawn darkness of a nation at war. Blackout curtains covered windows, streetlights were dimmed or extinguished, and military checkpoints dotted the roads. The threat of enemy action on American soil was real and immediate. German U-boats had sunk dozens of merchant ships within sight of our coast, and intelligence reports suggested that Germany was attempting to infiltrate sabotage teams into the United States. What we called Operation Pastorius, though we didn't know that name yet, was Nazi Germany's plan to cripple American industrial capacity through a campaign of strategic sabotage. I arrived at Amagansett Beach as the sun was rising over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Coast Guardsman John Cullen, the young man who'd encountered the suspicious individuals, was there to meet me. Cullen was maybe 21 years old, with a thin frame and nervous energy that suggested he was still processing what had happened to him in the darkness just hours before. "Agent Brennan," he said, saluting crisply despite his obvious exhaustion, "I can show you exactly where I encountered them." We walked along the beach, the sand still damp from high tide. Cullen's story was remarkable for both his bravery and the suspicious behavior of the men he'd encountered. He'd been on routine patrol when he spotted figures in the fog near the waterline. Approaching, he'd found 4 men, one of whom spoke English with a heavy German accent and claimed they were fishermen from Southampton whose boat had run aground. "But Agent Brennan, nothing about them made sense," Cullen said, his voice earnest. "They were wearing brand new clothing that was completely wrong for fishermen. One had on a nice suit. Their shoes were expensive, not work boots. And the one who did most of the talking, he kept saying things that were just off." "Off how?" I asked, mentally cataloguing every detail. He'd use words wrong, like he'd learned English from a book, but never really spoken it. At one point, he called the fog heavy mist weather, instead of just saying it was foggy. And when I asked where their boat was, he pointed toward the ocean and said it was beyond the breakers, which is technically correct, but not how any American fisherman would say it. Then he tried to bribe me with what must have been $300, telling me to forget this meeting happened. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. We reached the spot where Cullen had made his discovery. Coast Guard personnel had cordoned off an area about 50 yards from the high tide line. Partially buried in the sand were several waterproof boxes and bags. We carefully excavated them, finding a treasure trove of espionage equipment, explosives, detonators, timing devices, incendiary materials, and perhaps most damning, over $80,000 in American currency of various denominations. But it was the other items that told the real story. We found German cigarettes, maps with strategic industrial targets marked in German notation, and perhaps most incredibly, several articles of clothing with German labels still attached. These men had been so poorly prepared that they'd landed on American soil, carrying items that immediately identified them as German nationals. "Get all of this back to the New York office immediately," I instructed the Coast Guard team. "And I need your best sketch artist to work with Guardsman Cullen. We need descriptions of these men as detailed as possible." Back in Manhattan, the FBI's New York field office was a hive of controlled chaos. Director J. Edgar Hoover had made the capture of enemy agents on American soil his top priority, and every available agent was being mobilized. I worked with Cullen for hours, developing detailed descriptions of the four men. The leader, the one who'd done most of the talking, was about 35 years old, medium height with light brown hair and nervous mannerisms. He'd spoken the best English of the group, but had made those telltale linguistic mistakes that marked him as a non-native speaker, who'd learned the language formally rather than colloquially. Our break came faster than I could have hoped. By late afternoon on June 13th, we received a report from the ticket office at Pennsylvania Station. A clerk reported selling tickets to four men who matched our descriptions. The men had purchased tickets for different destinations, but all had paid with crisp new $20 bills and had asked questions about train schedules in a way that suggested unfamiliarity with American rail travel. One of them asked what time the railway departed. The clerk reported to our agent at the station. "Nobody in America calls it a railway. We say train or railroad." And they wanted to know if they needed permissions to travel to different cities, like they thought we had internal passports or something. It was weird enough that I remembered them. We now had confirmation that the suspects were in New York City, but finding them in a metropolis of 7 million people seemed impossible. That's when the investigation took its most unexpected turn. On the evening of June 14th, a man walked into FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. and announced that he was one of the German agents who'd landed on Long Island and that he wanted to defect and expose the entire operation. His name was George John Dash, and he was the leader of the group that Cullen had encountered on the beach. I was ordered to Washington immediately to participate in his interrogation. The overnight train ride gave me time to think about what would motivate an enemy agent to turn himself in less than 2 days after landing. Was it a trick, a German intelligence operation within an operation, or was Dash genuinely having second thoughts about his mission? Meeting Dash in the interrogation room at FBI headquarters, I got my answer within the first 5 minutes. The man was an absolute mess. Chain-smoking cigarettes, his hands trembling, his eyes darting around the room with barely controlled panic. He spoke English well, much better than Cullen had suggested, but with that same formal quality that marked him as someone who'd learned the language through study rather than immersion. "I want to tell you everything," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Everything about the operation, the other agents, the targets, all of it. But you must understand, I never wanted to do this. I lived in America for years before the war. I have friends here, I know this country, I know these people. When German intelligence recruited me, I thought I could come here and find a way to stop the operation from inside." Over the next 12 hours, Dash laid out the entire German sabotage plan in meticulous detail. Operation Pastorius, named after the first German settlement in America, involved 2 teams of 4 agents each. Dash's team had landed on Long Island, and a second team had landed on Florida's coast near Jacksonville. Their mission was to sabotage key industrial facilities over a 2-year period: aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, railroad terminals, bridges, and water supplies. The goal was to cripple American war production and spread fear among the civilian population. But what fascinated me most wasn't the operation itself, but rather all the ways these supposed elite agents had failed basic tradecraft from the moment they arrived. As Dash talked, a picture emerged of an intelligence operation that was doomed from its inception by poor planning, inadequate training, and fundamental misunderstandings about American society. "The training in Germany was terrible," Dash explained, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. "They taught us about explosives and targets, but almost nothing about how to actually live in America without drawing attention. They gave us American money and American clothes, but they didn't understand that Americans can tell when something is off. The clothes they gave us were all brand new, with the creases still in them from the store. The money was in sequential serial numbers. They gave us maps with German notation. They told us to say we were fishermen if questioned, but didn't teach us anything about fishing or boats." "What about your English?" I asked. "You speak it well, but there are tells, phrases that aren't quite right." Dash nodded vigorously. Exactly. I tried to tell them this during training. I lived in New York for almost 20 years before returning to Germany in 1939. I know how Americans speak, the slang, the casual way of expressing things. But the other men in my team, they learned English in classrooms. They could read technical manuals and follow instructions, but they couldn't have a natural conversation. When we were on the beach and the Coast Guardman approached, I was terrified that one of the others would speak and immediately expose us. "Tell me about that encounter," I said. "What exactly did you say to the guardsman?" Dash winced. I tried to act casual, but I was so nervous I made mistakes. I said we were fishermen from Southampton, which is a real place, but then I couldn't remember the name of any actual fishing boats or docks there. I talked about heavy mist weather, instead of just saying it was foggy, which must have sounded strange. And when he asked about our boat, I said it was beyond the breakers, because that was the technical term I'd learned, not realizing that real fishermen would just say out there, or off the beach. Every word I spoke, I was thinking, this sounds wrong, this sounds foreign, but I couldn't stop myself. As the interrogation continued, Dash provided information that allowed us to quickly round up the rest of his team. They'd checked into hotels in Manhattan using their real names, which was another catastrophic failure of basic spycraft. We arrested them within 48 hours of Dash's confession. Meanwhile, the FBI was working to locate the second team that had landed in Florida. The Florida team's story was even more remarkable for the agents' incompetence. They'd landed near Ponte Vedra Beach on June 17th and immediately made their way to Jacksonville. Within days, their leader, a man named Edward Curling, had also begun to have doubts about the mission. But rather than immediately contacting the FBI, Curling and his men had actually begun surveillance of potential targets while trying to decide what to do. What ultimately led to their capture was even more absurd than Dash's walk-in confession. One of the Florida team members, Herbert Haupt, decided to visit his parents in Chicago. Haupt had grown up in America and held American citizenship, but had traveled to Germany before the war and been recruited by German intelligence. His parents, horrified by what their son had become involved in, contacted a family friend who happened to be a Chicago police officer. That officer contacted the FBI, and we picked up Haupt on June 27th. He immediately gave up the locations of the other Florida team members. By the end of June 1942, all 8 German agents were in custody. The capture was trumpeted as a major victory for the FBI and Director Hoover personally. President Roosevelt ordered that the men be tried by military tribunal rather than civilian court, setting a precedent for how enemy combatants captured on American soil would be handled. 6 of the 8 agents, including Curling and several others, were sentenced to death and executed in August 1942. Dash and another cooperating agent, Ernst Berger, received lengthy prison sentences, but were later deported to Germany after the war. For me, the most fascinating aspect of the entire operation wasn't the capture itself, but rather the analysis phase that followed. I was assigned to a team that studied every aspect of Operation Pastorius to understand how German intelligence had failed so completely. Our findings were compiled into a classified report that became required reading for counterintelligence officers throughout the war. The fundamental problem, we concluded, was that German intelligence had dramatically underestimated how difficult it is to successfully infiltrate agents into a foreign country. They'd assumed that speaking English, carrying American money and wearing American clothes would be sufficient. They hadn't understood that successful infiltration requires deep cultural knowledge, perfect command of colloquial language, understanding of social norms and behaviors, and most importantly, the ability to think and react like a native rather than an actor playing a role. Every one of the 8 agents had made mistakes that exposed them, using formal language instead of casual speech, showing unfamiliarity with basic aspects of American life, carrying items that identified them as German, displaying nervous behavior that drew attention, and perhaps most critically, underestimating the awareness and vigilance of ordinary Americans during wartime. Coast Guardsman John Cullen's instinct that something was wrong, based on nothing more than the agent's word choices and clothing, had been the first domino to fall. The ticket clerk's recognition that something was off about how the men asked about train travel had been another. Even Dash's decision to confess had been driven partly by his realization that the operation was already compromised and that it was only a matter of time before they were all caught. I spent the rest of the war working counterintelligence operations, always mindful of the lessons from Operation Pastorius. We trained our own agents in the importance of cultural immersion, taught them to recognize the subtle tells that expose foreign operatives, and developed protocols for investigating suspicious behavior that seemed minor but might indicate enemy activity. The case also fundamentally changed how the FBI approached counterintelligence work. Before Pastorius, there was a tendency to look for dramatic spy activities, secret meetings, coded messages, dead drops. After Pastorius, we learned to pay attention to the small things: word choices, clothing details, behavioral anomalies, cultural mistakes. The best counterintelligence work we discovered often involved noticing what was slightly off rather than catching someone obviously engaged in espionage. I worked one particularly memorable case in 1943 where we caught a German agent in Boston based solely on his inability to correctly name the positions on a baseball team. He claimed to be a lifelong Red Sox fan, but referred to the goalkeeper instead of the catcher. That single word, overheard in a bar conversation by an alert FBI informant, led to the unraveling of a small espionage network. The agent had learned about baseball from German intelligence briefing books that had translated the positions literally from German sports terminology. Another case involved a suspected agent in Detroit who drew suspicion because he always referred to automobiles as motor cars, a term that had largely fallen out of use in American English by the 1940s, but was still common in German translations. He also consistently said motorway instead of highway, another tell that marked him as someone who'd learned English through European sources rather than American immersion. These might seem like trivial details, but in counterintelligence work, trivial details are often the difference between success and failure. A spy's cover story might be perfect on paper, their documents might be flawless, their background might check out completely. But if they say railway instead of railroad, or heavy mist weather instead of foggy, or motorcar instead of car, they've exposed themselves to anyone trained to listen for such tells. By the time the war ended in 1945, I'd been involved in the investigation and capture of dozens of enemy agents operating on American soil. Some were sophisticated operations that required months of surveillance and investigation. Others, like Operation Pastorius, practically announced their presence through basic mistakes. But in every case, the principle was the same. Successful intelligence work requires not just technical skills, but deep cultural understanding. And the absence of that understanding creates vulnerabilities that alert observers can exploit. I retired from the FBI in 1962 after 20 years of service. I'd worked through World War II, the early Cold War, and the beginning of the space age. Intelligence work had become more sophisticated, cover identities more carefully constructed, and agents better trained. But the fundamental lesson from that June morning in 1942 on a Long Island beach remained relevant. It's not enough to look the part. You have to think, speak, and act the part so completely that even your subconscious reactions are indistinguishable from those of a native. Looking back now, I'm struck by how close Operation Pastorius came to succeeding despite all the agent's mistakes. If Dash hadn't walked in and confessed, we still would have caught his team eventually based on the evidence from the beach and the reports from the train station clerk. But the Florida team might have remained at large long enough to attempt at least some sabotage. The fact that both teams were captured within 2 weeks of landing was due partly to good investigative work, but also partly to the Germans' catastrophic failures in preparation and execution. The story of Operation Pastorius became a case study taught at the FBI Academy, at military intelligence schools, and in classified briefings for decades after the war. The lesson wasn't just about catching spies, but about understanding the profound difficulty of operating successfully in a foreign culture. You can memorize facts, learn languages, and study customs, but unless you've lived in a place long enough to internalize its rhythms and patterns, you'll always be an outsider who risks exposure through small mistakes. That June morning, when 4 German agents waded ashore on Long Island and immediately began making linguistic and cultural errors that marked them as foreign operatives, they sealed their fate. Their first words on American soil exposed them as surely as if they'd been wearing German uniforms. And in doing so, they taught American counterintelligence a lesson that proved invaluable throughout the war and beyond. Pay attention to the details. Trust your instincts when something seems off, and remember that the most dangerous enemies are often exposed not by dramatic discoveries, but by small inconsistencies that careful observers notice and investigate. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I was 32 years old when I helped catch 8 German spies who announced their presence through their inability to speak and act like the Americans they were pretending to be. That case shaped my entire career and taught me that in intelligence work, there's no such thing as an insignificant detail. Everything matters, especially the things that seem too small to notice.